Hi guys, this is my first recorded lecture for a class, and here we go. I'm going to take a minute so I can share my screen with you. So I'm going to keep myself up here in the corner, so hopefully I won't be too distracting, but this way you guys can see me and the screen here, I hope at least. And so today we're talking about conducting experiments. And this is something that we've really been talking about the entire semester so far, but we're really kind of doubling down, talking about experimental methods in particular, not just all different kinds of research. You know that a couple of weeks ago we talked about non-experimental methods, talking about observation, we talked about case studies, we talked about archival research, we revisited correlation, and so we've talked about all of these other kinds of methods, and now we're talking specifically about experiments. And so we're going to revisit a couple of ideas from earlier in the semester, things that you might already know from other classes, things like intro psych, and maybe some things that can come up when you're talking about statistics, making graphs, things like that. And so we're going to revisit some of that stuff over the course of this lecture and next class's lecture. And for next class, I'll have a couple of videos posted, kind of broken up by topic. And so today we're going to talk kind of through this process, and we're going to start by talking about selecting research participants. Now, we already talked about that. We talked about sampling, we talked about ways of sampling, how to sample our population. We know that the population is the entire group that we're interested in, or the sample is just the group that we're studying. And we want to be able to generalize those results. We hope that by learning something from the data, we have the data that from the participants that we've chosen, and we hope that those results are going to apply to our larger group. We don't only care about the group that we're studying, we care about this bigger group, but we're studying this little group to say something about them. And this is this idea that we're generalizing when we think about our statistics. This is where inferential statistics come in. We're going to look at the statistics from this group and infer that this applies, what that might mean for the larger group. And so when we're talking about selecting research participants, we're thinking about, again, this conducting experiments. How do we select participants for a study, and how many participants do we need? And when we're designing our studies, this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and want to take great care when thinking about. So we talked about different sampling techniques in the past, random samples, convenient samples. We talked about these different kinds of probability samples. And so you might want to go back, revisit some of those ideas. We talked about those around when we were talking about surveys and kind of how to get participants for surveys. And so we want to think maybe kind of back into those terms and just kind of reminding us of what these ideas mean when we're talking about random samples. These are usually more helpful and more important when we're trying to accurately describe the population. But when we're testing hypotheses about behavior, non-probability sampling is usually fine. And this is a little bit comforting for us because we know in our studies that we're doing, basically what we're doing here is we're using convenient samples, non-probability sampling, and we know from what we've discussed in this class that a lot of research that's going on at a lot of universities and certainly elsewhere are also using to some degree or another these kinds of non-probability or convenient samples. And so it's good to know that when we're talking about hypothesis testing, it's usually okay. And again, we want to make sure that we're controlling for things, we're thinking about our population, we want to be able to generalize those results to the group that we care about, but we want to make sure that we at least can know that these non-convenient samplings are usually fine for the kinds of studies that we've been talking about in this class where we're doing hypothesis testing. When we think about selecting research participants, we know that there is, as I've kind of been alluding to in what I've said so far, this impact on external validity or generalizability, and that's really important. So we want to make sure that even in our sample, even if we're using some kind of non-probability sampling, we have to pay attention to those characteristics. If we're trying to say something about this population that's a very diverse group, we have to kind of take care and make sure that our sample is looking something like that. If our sample is not very diverse, maybe we can bring that up in our discussion section, maybe as a limitation of the study, is we don't know if these results would generalize to a more diverse group. And so we want to really pay attention to that, take care with that. and make sure that we're not overgeneralizing our results. And again, remember in your discussion sections, it's okay to bring up these kinds of issues. It's really better for us to bring them up ourselves as scientists than to have someone else criticize our study because, oh, maybe it's not generalizing. We can bring that up. We can also just bring that up to the forefront as an area for future research, that someone else can run another study similar to ours, replicate our study, but in a more diverse group or in a different population, maybe different gender, different ethnicity, different location, whatever that factor is that might matter for generalizability. We know that we typically have more accurate results with a larger sample or a smaller sample. Which one? So I want you to think about that for a minute. Think back, we've talked about this before. So do we have more accurate results with a larger sample or a smaller sample? And this is actually a question that I've put into the Blackboard folder for today. So if you pause right here, you can go and answer that question. And then come back here, we'll talk a little further about this. All right, so hopefully you answered that question. Those questions are going to be participation questions, just like our poll everywhere questions usually are. So it doesn't matter if you get it right or wrong, that's okay. If you got it wrong, I might give a little bit of feedback to you or something like that, but you'll get credit either way just by answering those questions, still participating in our class. Again, we're trying to make it as normal as possible. So we'll do this a couple of times throughout these different posted lectures that you can just pause that and come back to that after you answer this question. And again, I'll always have those questions in the same folder with the lectures. So all the questions for that day will be organized like that. And so again, our question was, you have is a larger sample or a smaller sample typically more accurate for our research results? And typically we have more accurate results with a larger sample. And again, this makes sense if you think about it logically. The larger our sample is, the closer that number of people we've sampled is actually to the size of our population. So larger sample, more accurate results. It's also true that the larger our sample is, the more likely our results are going to be statistically significant. So we haven't talked a lot yet about statistical significance. You might remember it from stats, maybe intro, things like that. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about data analysis in another week or so. But we also typically have more statistically significant results with a larger sample. We won't really get into the reasons for why, but again, we'll revisit these ideas when we talk about data analysis. We have noted in our class before that there are different ways to calculate how many participants we need. So when we come to the second question on our slide here, but we're really not going to get into those methods. Your textbook goes into them a little bit, but they're beyond the scope of what I want us to focus on for this class. But know that there are ways of calculating this, and in some of your groups, I know that that is something that you may have discussed or might be going on behind the scenes. Things like power analysis, there are ways of doing this, but also often in many fields, in many different types of research, there are just kind of guidelines and norms for how many participants you need for a particular kind of study. And so for when you're working with a particular method or with a particular topic, you might know or be able to see in the research, maybe in your literature search, maybe you have been reading a couple of studies, they're all doing a similar kind of thing, and they use a similar number of subjects. And that actually could be why. That might be what's going on there. And so you might know, maybe with this particular survey, I'm going to get a really big sample, but maybe with my EEG research, for instance, electroencephalography, studying the brain waves, maybe I'm going to have a smaller sample potentially. And there's different reasons for these things. Again, we're not going to go into why certain norms exist for certain fields, but know that for each different fields, different types of research, these norms sometimes do exist. And so sometimes we might calculate how many participants we need, and sometimes, again, this norm might exist. We might follow the guidelines of our field.